Hi, it's Stan Phelps, and I want to welcome everyone. This is episode 7 of the Back to Black webinar series. I'm Stan Phelps. Going to say a quick hello. We want to say hello, Brian.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
So Brian was my co-author on the gray goldfish, and today we're going to share how you can navigate the gray areas of leading 5 generations. As I mentioned, the 7th episode in the Back to Black webinar series. A little bit of background on why we chose ECPC, so employees and customers, post-corona and getting back to profitability, back to black. Let me give you a little bit of the quick backstory. So the story begins all the way back in 1973 when 2 brothers, Angus Young, who was 18, and his brother Malcolm decided to start a band. And that band was called AC/DC. And just 1 year after the band was put together, they decided to hire a new lead singer, another Australian who had immigrated from Scotland, Bon Scott, and he became the lead lyricist and lead singer and frontman for the band. And just 1 year later, after getting together, they would launch their first album, High Voltage, which became successful. And over the next 5 years, they would launch another 5 albums. And in early 1980, they were literally just over 40 years ago, they were finishing a tour for Highway to Hell, and they happened to be in London, and the band went out for a big night of drinking in London. And Bon Scott, the lead singer, was a notorious partier, and he just over-imbibed and ended up blacking out and passing out. And in order for him to sleep it off, his friends thought it was a good idea to put him in the back of a car. Well, unfortunately, during the night, while he was unconscious, he vomited and aspirated on his own vomit and passed away tragically at a very young age. And the band was obviously, this was a tragedy, a crisis. The band flew back to Australia where they held services for Bon, and they couldn't see a way forward. They thought about quitting. And their friends and their relatives said, no, you've got to press on. In Bon's honor, you need to keep going with the band. That's what he would have wanted. So about a month after his death, in late March of 1980, they ended up auditioning and hiring a new lead singer, Brian Johnson. And within 1 week of Brian being selected, they handed him a plane ticket in early April 1980. And a week later, the band touched down in the Bahamas. And over the next 7 weeks, they worked on the next album in AC/DC. And they decided, Bon Scott, who was the lead lyricist, not to use any of his lyrics. So literally they had to start anew, break in a new lead singer, and over the next 7 weeks, they would work together and they would launch one of the most famous albums of all time, Back in Black. And that signature black cover was an homage to Bon Scott and his memory. And that album would go on to sell, in some estimates, over 50 million albums worldwide, starting in 1980. And in some lists, the second best-selling album of all time. And for us, it's this idea of going back to black is a metaphor of all of the times that we're dealing with right now. And so again, today is really about the 7th in a 9-episode series. Today is all about leading across the generations. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Brian. Brian, I've known for a long time. has had a storied career in both the military and in the private sector in both marketing and sales. And Brian had something that happened a number of years back that really had him rechange his thinking. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Dan. So, ladies and gentlemen, picture this with me. I'm sitting in the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company. At the head of the table is the president and CEO, and assembled around the table are his direct reports, the senior vice presidents in charge of the different functions of the company. Immediately to my left is an empty chair, which is supposed to be occupied by my 25-year-old employee. As the president is telling his latest story, I start to hear it from down the hall. Flip-flop, flip-flop. And then I hear flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. And I can tell by the frequency of the flipping and the flopping that my millennial employee knows she's late and is now running to the meeting. She gets there just in time, sits down as the president is finishing his story, and she says, that was a great story. Should we get started? And then she begins to provide us a very thoughtful, insightful, on-point presentation about why our sales force is not doing as well as we think they should be. She looks at our products, she looks at the competition, she looks at our own salespeople. She tries to engage the different vice presidents around the table, asking them questions. Is this what you're experiencing? That sort of thing. And in the body language, what I see is this. Folded arms, head tilted back, heavy sighs. These people are not listening to her. So she finishes up her presentation. I ask if there's any comments or questions, and there really aren't. So the meeting adjourns and I go back to my office. And that's when the parade begins. And the parade begins with senior vice presidents coming to my door saying, what was she thinking? She comes into the meeting late, acts like she owns the place, called me by my first name. I've been working here for 25 years. She's been here for what, 1? She didn't even come to work yesterday. She should have been working on her presentation. She was probably goofing off. Brian, you got to do something about her. And then my millennial employee came to my office and she said, that was BS, except I'm pretty sure she spelled out the acronym. She said, I worked really hard on that presentation. I tried to engage everyone around the table. No one wanted to pay attention. I even worked from home yesterday to make sure that I had everything nailed. Brian, you got to do something about those people. And so it was that moment that I said, gosh, I have to figure out how to bring these two groups together, because I found that one person's perspective didn't always align with the expectations of others. See, we all have a mental image of the perfect employee, what that person looks like, what they talk like, what they act like. And that mental image is largely driven by our own experiences, how we were raised, what school was like, what our friends did. In other words, that perspective of the perfect employee is largely driven by our own generation. And we're at a very unique time in history where there were 5 distinct generations in the workforce today. So Stan, why don't you talk us through some of these generations? Let's line them up, and then maybe you can talk to us about some of the older generations. Stan, you're on mute.
Thank you, Brian. The idea of having a one-size-fits-all approach to all of these generations really just doesn't play as we go forward. To your point, there's 5, for the first time ever, 5 distinct generations in the workplace. Look at where you're at this year in terms of what you're going to be in terms of this year. You'll figure out which generation you're part of. For me, I'm firmly in the Gen X. Now, Gen X at the moment, a couple of things have happened this year in 2020. First off, millennials this year will become 50% of the workforce. And Gen X, who's one of the smaller generations, is actually holding the majority of leadership positions right now. And we're in an unenviable task because we're what's called the sandwich generation. We not only as leaders have to manage up 2 generations, but we also have to figure out how to effectively manage down. So before we start to understand a little bit of how we manage and lead across the generations, I think to Brian's point, it's good to spend a little bit of time to understand each generation and what shaped their perspective. And if we start, and I always like to do this, this is a funny thing. Before we start into the generations, you know, I love this, and rest in peace, Jerry Stiller. But we're gonna do a little bit of Festivus. So if you're not familiar with this holiday, Festivus is that one day of the year where you get to air your grievances against the others in your family and your relatives. But we're going to do it older generation versus younger generation. So I want you to open the chat right now. And here's the thing, we're going to start with the older generation. So if you're a Gen X or older, I want you to write your grievances of folks that are in the younger millennial and Gen Z. Let's see if we have some feedback in there in the chat. Peter A, don't listen. Okay, great. I love that. All right, anyone else? No patience, right? Expect things right now. It was always better in the old days for the older generations. John, no respect. Okay. Boomer here. Okay. All right, so that, all right, I'm loving that they're coming in. No manners. Love the enthusiasm. Okay. Now, it's not fair if we don't give the younger generations an opportunity. So let's now open it up to the younger generations. What are some of the grievances that younger generations have against the older generations? Okay, lack of empathy, I like that. Set in their ways, don't want to do new things or think in new ways. Inflexible, not very technology literate. Okay, great. Excellent. We might have 1 or 2 more coming in. So I think all of those points are valid, but again, let's dive in a little bit and start to get an understanding of what makes these generations tick, and if there's one word that describes everything. So this is General Patton. He had a great quote. This is, a lot of people sometimes call them the traditionalists. This is the matures, described by many as the greatest generation. And if you had to sum it up in one quote, it's this: if I do my full duty, the rest will take care of itself. And again, their one word is this idea of duty. They were shaped by growing up through the Great Depression. And if you think about it, while they were growing up, World War II after the Great Depression. Now, Brian is an Air Force pilot, and this is a really telling example of this generation's commitment to duty. At certain points during World War II, the folks that served on the bombers, 1 out of every 4 missions, the plane never made it back. And think about that when you had to wake up each day knowing your odds. And this generation did it because that's what was expected of them. This generation faced at points 25% unemployment, in some places in the country up to 10% homelessness. And here's the thing, they're still working. This is my father-in-law, Fred Wills. We took him to Hawaii last year. He had served in Korea. He literally just 2 months ago retired. He almost made it to his 90th birthday working in zoning and planning for the town of Shelton, Connecticut. So they're still active, they're working much later, and they still have a lot to contribute. Now, let's talk about the next, and this is a big cohort, big like the millennials. This is boomers. And so boomers are often defined by their work. If you introduce yourself to the boomers, they're often going to lead with what they do for a living. Maybe a minute or two down the road, they might tell you about their family. If you walk into a boomer's office, many times you're going to see certificates on the wall. Brian once laughs that he walked into a colleague's office and saw a completion of an MS-DOS course from the early 1990s. And that boomer was proud. That was, by the way, if you're a millennial, that's what was around before Windows, was MS-DOS. But if you had to sum up this generation in one word, work. They are defined by their work. If you think about them in the workplace, they're usually the last person to leave. They're all about paying their dues, keeping their head down, right? And lifelong learning. You know, they see FaceTime and being able to spend time with their boss as a badge of honor. And that sums up, this idea of work sums up. Now let's talk about my generation, the Gen Xers. Quote unquote, the latchkey kids, because in this generation, divorce rates in some parts of the country were over 50%. And so growing up potentially in a one-parent household, letting yourself in, that's the latchkey bit. This generation was the first one not to see work as the end-all and be-all. And so for this generation, it was a mix of both work and life. And if you had to sum them up in just one word, that one word is balance. They're the first generation to kind of confront authority. They typically don't like to be micromanaged. They want to be able to do their stuff on their own time and they crave that flexibility. So that's matures, that's boomers, that's Xers. And I'm going to throw it back to you, Brian. So that's the older generations. What's up with that? Talk about the younger generations and why we're maybe a little more comfortable with these folks.
Yeah, so even if each of these generations has their own idiosyncrasies and they kind of do weird things or they do them differently than you're used to, they've been around for a long time. And so at least we're used to matures, baby boomers, and Gen Xers. But one of the things that always comes up when we're talking about generations are the millennials. And so let's talk about first why the millennials are different. And it starts with high expectations. The millennials are the trophy kids. If you were a millennial and you got first place in a running race when you were a kid, you got a trophy. If you were in 10th place of that same race, you got a trophy. And as you can see from the picture, sometimes the trophies are as big as the children themselves. I can tell you because that kid on the top block, that's my son. And when he came home with that trophy that was just about as tall as he was, I said to him, son, it's all downhill from here, buddy. You're not going to keep getting trophies that are as big as you. So it's not just sports, though. It's how students were graded in the classroom. If you can back up just one more, Stan. I have a friend who is an elementary school teacher, and I asked her, what color do you grade the papers in? She said purple. I said, well, why don't you grade them in red like we used to? She said, well, red hurts their self-esteem. And it's not just elementary school. There's a professor at Duke University who, instead of grading her students, has her students grade each other. So any guesses as to what the average grade is in that class? Yeah, it's an A. And parents are way more involved than they used to be. So in my free time, I'm an admissions officer for the United States Air Force Academy. And as part of that role, I interview and evaluate high school students for acceptance into the academy and the subsequent scholarship that comes with it. So I sat down with an applicant back in the days when you could sit down with applicants. And this is a great kid. So super leader, great with grades, just a great human being. And I asked him, hey, did you bring your resume with you? Like I ask, because I like to use it as a framework for our conversation. He slid the resume across to me and he said, yeah, here it is. It should be pretty good. My parents worked on it last night. And I thought to myself, how weird that his parents wrote his resume for him. And then I thought to myself, how weird that he told me. But the reason he told me is because this isn't anything new to him. He was raised as his parents' friend. They've been helping him with projects throughout his life, whether they be school or work or college applications. And so this is just another step in that direction. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal of a young businessman who was assigned a project by his manager. The deadline came and went. His manager came to him and said, hey, where's the project? He said, oh, I forgot. Why didn't you remind me? Well, you know what? If your parents have been reminding you of deadlines your entire life, it's a pretty big transition to not be reminded of things when you get to work. And parents are only trying to look out for their children. It's not like they're trying to do something bad. It's just very different than it used to be. So when I was a kid and I was high energy and I got rambunctious, my mother would kick me out of the house. She'd tell me to go ride my bike. And she'd tell me to come home when the street lights came on. I didn't have a phone. I didn't even have a watch. My mother had no idea where I was, but all she wanted me to do is come home when it got dark. It's very different these days. The parenting styles are hugely different. And it's not because the parents are trying to do the wrong thing. They're actually trying to do the right thing. So with this as context as to why the millennials are different, let's talk a little bit about how the millennials are different. And it starts with the millennials are group-oriented, collaborative leaders. They were raised to work in teams. A lot of times in school, they were taught to work in group projects. And anybody who's in business knows that the ability to get somebody's buy-in for your initiative is super helpful. The ability to work with a team is super helpful. The challenge comes in when we ask the millennials to work on projects by themselves. So again, kind of back to my Air Force Academy interviews. A question I'll commonly ask is, well, can you tell me about your leadership experience? And a typical answer is, oh yeah, I worked on the prom committee. Oh, sweet, okay, tell me more about that. Well, there were 5 of us, and we all worked on the dance for the prom. Okay, great. And so what part were you in charge of? And the student says, well, there were 5 of us. We all worked together. I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but there had to be a part that you were in charge of. What did you do specifically? And they say, there were 5 of us. And we all worked together. So great to be group oriented, but sometimes it bites them when they get into the office. This is a group that is super comfortable with diversity. And again, when you think about the future of the world, the future of our country and business, it is not a bunch of old white men. It's people who speak different languages from different cultures, who look different, and the ability to interact with those folks is super helpful. The millennials bring this to the table. Next slide, please. The millennials are multitasking experts. Anybody who knows one knows that they can sit on the couch, streaming Netflix, texting with their friends, sending a message on Snapchat while they're working on work from home, eating a bag of Cheetos. And so to older generations, that seems very unfocused. But when you think about the flow of information that's coming to us on a daily basis, the millennials, and I too, would argue, don't you want somebody who can do more than one thing at a time? They also have huge goals, but they struggle a little bit with the execution. So when I was a kid, I came to my father. He was sitting in the family room watching television. I stood in front of the TV, so he had to pay attention to me, because back then you couldn't pause live TV. And I said, Dad, I want to be a professional football player. And he looked at me and he said, you'll never be a professional football player. My God, Brian, those are big, strong men. You're skinny. You'll never be a pro. And then he sort of leaned over so I could watch television some more. And so as I started to walk away, he said, you want to be a professional football player? I said, yeah, Dad, I do. He said, well, why don't you go out and mow the lawn? Lawn mowing builds muscle. And that's the sort of feedback that older generations used to get. Now, millennials got different feedback. They got, if you put your mind to it, you can do anything. If you try your hardest, you can be anything, because you're special. And even the word special, if we'll go to the next slide, means different things to different generations. To the younger generations, it means that the world is your oyster. Every person's unique and future possibilities are limitless. To Generation X, it's reserved for people with physical and mental disabilities, like the Special Olympics. And to the 2 older generations, it is an insult, as in, what do you think you are, special? So if we'll go to the next slide, we're going to have a quick poll, and I'd like you to just type into the chat window, how long do millennials expect to pay their dues? And I'll let you define that however you'd like. But as a business person, you have to pay your dues for a certain period of time, and then you can get promoted, or you can get an increase.
Let's do it by years, right? So less than a year to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, or more than 3 years. That help?
Yeah, sounds good.
Get some feedback.
Less than a year, 1 to 2, over 3. What do you think?
2 to 3 or more than 3 years.
Okay.
How long do they expect? We're getting a bunch of feedback in here.
Yep, 1 to 2, a lot of ones to 2s, 2 to 3. Yep, John was optimistic. He thought it was greater than 3, but maybe he's thinking that's what it should be. 3 years after college. Okay, great.
Shall we pull back the window?
Yes, let's pull back the curtain. This is what studies have shown. So 16% expect to pay their dues for less than a year. 51%, 1 to 2 years. So ladies and gentlemen, that means that 2/3 of millennials expect to pay their dues for less than 2 years. So when you compare that back to the mature generation where people used to work in the factory for 30 or 40 years and then maybe get promoted to foreman, this is a different set of expectations. And so as leaders, we have to think about, okay, if I don't necessarily have a promotion or a raise to give, how can I help the millennials feel like they are progressing in their career? Maybe it's customer-facing opportunities. Maybe it's leading a team of their peers. But there are things that we can be doing because the expectation is absolutely there. So we've talked about the millennials, but there's a generation behind them. So what about Generation Z? Unfortunately for Generation Z, the left-hand side of the page is nothing unique or special. They had their formative years in what we call the Great Recession. So layoffs, foreclosures, shrunken 401ks. And what that did is cause their commitment to erode. They're not so sure that they want to be all in on a particular company that they work for. And this attitude, coupled with a huge rise in technology, has spawned what we call the gig economy. And I think most of you probably know somebody who maybe has a 8-to-5 job, but then makes jewelry on the weekends or drives for Uber or has some other gig that they've got going on. You know, there was a survey of high school students recently, and 61% said they wanted to be entrepreneurs when they got older. 61%. So when you think about Generation Z, this is a generation that is working for themselves, even when they're working for you. There is a lack of commitment there. It doesn't make them a bad employee, but there's a lack of commitment. And 9 out of 10 said that meaning was most important. So when we think about this as leaders, what can we do to share with this generation about why your company is important, doing good things for the world, why they are doing good things for the world, why their job matters, why their individual tasks matter, because meaning carries a lot of weight. Like the millennials, they want fast answers. So this is a generation that has never had a time where they could not ask their phone an answer or ask that disk that's sitting on their counter for an answer. So they don't need their managers to give them the simple stuff. They're looking for mentors to help them navigate work, help them navigate life. And this is a generation that really believes in work-life integration. So as Stan mentioned, Generation X was looking for balance, work-life balance. Hey, I'll work hard for you until 5 o'clock and then leave me alone. This is a generation that, you know, maybe at the coffee shop at 9 or 10 a.m., but they'll work hard for you at 11 p.m. or even 2 a.m. This is something that's tough, particularly for baby boomers, because baby boomers like to see people working. And an old mantra is, if I don't see you working, you're probably not. Generation Z doesn't fit in so well with that. They'd like you to measure them by results, and it doesn't matter when or where they get that done. The next slide, like the millennials, they're group-oriented, diverse individuals. They're multitasking experts, but they're nonverbal. This is a generation that never had to call a toy store to see if their toy was in stock. They never had to call a restaurant to see if they could get a reservation. They didn't call their friends to get everybody together. It was all done online. And everybody who's on the call knows that sometimes you need to have a tough conversation with a client or a coworker. And if you haven't had a lot of experience having face-to-face conversations, this can make it tough when Generation Z gets to work. This is yesterday's junior employees, and no, that is not Stan Phelps in the center of the picture at his prom. And this is today's junior employees. So, you know, the question is, hey, is the guy with the tats and the laptop, is he a bad employee because he looks like that? No. How about the girl with the pink hair and the nose ring? Is she going to be a bad employee? It's the same thing we've always been taught, that you can't judge a book by its cover, but it's a bigger deal now because people who are coming to work are looking and acting differently than the older generations might expect. So Stan, I'll hand it back to you for some best practices and some of the things we learned in the writing of our book.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We wanted to look at practical ways that leaders were able to navigate these gray areas and be able to manage across the generations. And so we created the Gray Goldfish Project, where we looked at over 200 brands, and essentially we share 50 kind of tips within the book that essentially cut across these 8 main areas. And by the way, before I jump into this, because we're about probably 6 or 7 minutes away from Q&A, and I've already seen, Brian, some questions come in there, which is awesome. But feel free, if you have a question or a comment, to type it in there, and we're about there. Given the time, I want to just cover recruiting, project management, and feedback/mentoring for a couple of different ways that you can manage the gray. And we'll start with recruiting and onboarding. And I love sharing this. This is a great example from Bank of America. And this is obviously towards the millennials and Gen Zs that they're recruiting. And what you'll see in this verbiage is a lot of the things that Brian touched on. You know, the things that matter to these individuals, being able to work in a team, you know, being able to be guided through mentors, not managers, understanding that the work that they do on a day-to-day basis has actual meaning, and they're actually solving problems that make an impact. Here's another one. This is from the military and the US Army. As Brian shared earlier, these younger generations have a lot of parental influence. And so this is a great acknowledgement of that from the US Army, because they realize not only are they recruiting that potential soldier, they're also on the hook to convince mom and dad that they're going to make them continue with their education and further the involvement. So they're selling the parents as much on the armed services as they are on that recruit. And a couple things to think about. This is a great example in feedback and mentoring from Pitney Bowes. Pitney Bowes is, if you're not familiar with them, they do a lot of mail services and postage services, machines that spit out the postage. And they realized that they had this older generation that had worked for decades in this company, and you had this younger generation that was coming up, and they needed to figure a way to get them to work together. And so Pitney Bowes started to create these intergenerational teams, and they promised the older generations, hey, we value your experience, but we're going to ask you to work with these younger generations to kind of pull them along. And so a couple of the lessons there is that those managers need to know that they need to explain to the younger generations how they're going to reach their goals. And it's not just incumbent upon the managers. For the millennials and the Gen Zs, they have to be proactive, right? They need to be asking for the things that they need to do to be able to move forward and advance in the company. They just can't take for granted that this is a one-way street. Last example comes from project management. And this is a great example we shared in the book from Safelite Auto Glass. And what you realize is that millennials, if they're not engaged and feel like they have ownership, you're going to lose them. And so what Safelite did was really encourage the managers to be able to give projects to the younger generations to get that sense of ownership and control. And specifically, they guided the managers to say, look, don't give them stuff where it has to be perfect. Give them stuff in the, that they can own, but 70, 80%, they can learn and grow, but have that sense of control and ownership. And just like we shared with Pitney Bowes, the feedback for the younger generations is don't just wait till you're assigned something. Proactively look for stuff that you can own and go to your boss with suggestions. Last one from project management. This is Whole Foods. An interesting one as it relates to oversight and transparency. So the younger generations expect a level of transparency when they work, whereas the older generations, you can kind of be on a need-to-know basis. And one of the things that Whole Foods did was take that step to make all of the reporting across not only their store, but other stores in the region transparent. And that allowed them to be able to, the teams to feel like they had control over the information, that they knew how they were making progress along the way. And so the feedback here is if you're an older generation managing the younger generation, don't feel like you have to micromanage. Make things as much as transparent as possible and not feel like you have to control everything. And then for the younger generations, know that the older generations want to have that sense of progress and knowing that you're working towards it. So make sure you're meeting your deadlines and you're being proactive to show the steps that you're taking to achieve progress. One of the coolest tools that we created, and I give Brian all the credit for this, he really came in with a lot of this insight, is to understand very quickly how to be able to manage and lead across the generations. And so we created the gray leadership matrix. And let me show you how it works. You simply, as a leader, you go across the top column to look at where your generation is. And then like I am an Xer, so I would go over to that green column. And then depending upon who I was leading, it could be a mature, someone from my own generation, a boomer, I would then work my way down to be able to get the insight. So in this case, and in this example, it's a boomer leading a millennial. And then in each of these boxes is tips on how to recruit, train, manage, and inspire for that specific generation, even your own generation. And to me, I think we've all sat through these generational insights talks. What I love about this, it's a one-page tool that you can pull out when you're dealing with the different generations to be able to have that insight. With that, I'd like to open it up. I'm going to go in, open the Q&A here, but again, feel free to type that into the Q&A. I know Sal is managing the chat. And we're going to start out with a question or a comment from Julie. It's the boomers that gave us those trophies as an ex-lennial, so right on the cusp of Gen X and millennial. We didn't ask for trophies. The boomers overprotected us and failed to show us how to be an adult. The phrase, Let me do that for you because it's easier, was abundant during my childhood. Thank you, Julie, not only for representing the Pacific Northwest on this webinar, but that's an excellent question. Brian, why don't you give it a shot and I'll add some commentary.
So I think it's exactly right. What baby boomers were reacting to was how they were raised. So I was raised by a mature I'm the fifth of five. So my brothers and sisters are all baby boomers. We're all kind of raised the same. And my parents were hard cases. They weren't bad people. It was just like, yeah, you hammer your kid, you yell at them if they're bad, and perhaps, more than yelling. And so the boomers were like, oh, I'm going to be totally different than this. I'm going to be hands-on. I'm going to be super nice. I felt my self-esteem as a child get damaged, not me, but the average baby boomer. I'm going to do something different for my kids. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make sure they're recognized and rewarded for everything that they do that's even remotely good. And they'll feel much better than I did as a child. Okay, well, yeah, to a point. And then, those children are smart enough, just like Julie, to go, dude, this is meaningless. Like 10th place, I got a participation ribbon. This is stupid.
Right.
So it was with the good intentions, but different outcomes perhaps than were intended.
Great. I think you covered that one. And I want to bring up one thing that Alan had brought up earlier, and I answered it. He said, weren't the boomers the ones that civil rights and protesting the Vietnam War, they embraced conflict. So he was asking, well, is it wrong to say that the millennials were the first to embrace conflict? And so I said, you're right, but we're really more talking about in the workplace. And really the millennials were the first ones to really question authority and take from what the boomers had done in society and really bring that tone into the workplace. And I think, Brian, you can expound on this. I think for Xers, we were the first generation to see lifelong employment, that promise be broken. And
that's right. So exactly what you just said, Stan. It was the boomers were in the streets socially. They were totally willing to question authority, but not really at work. Picture the old IBM, people wearing short sleeve shirts and ties, and you wore a tie to work every day because that's what you're supposed to wear. X was the first one to go like, hey, why is this? And you're right. It's because the parents got divorced, so that commitment eroded at home. And then they saw their parents get laid off en masse for the first time. And they're like, why am I like giving my heart and soul like my parents did to this company who just laid them off? And so that created what people sometimes perceive as cynicism or bitterness from Generation X.
Right. And I'll share this, just how different it is. I was raised like you, Brian, by a mature. And so my dad worked for the same company for 40 years. And so I share that. That's, back in his generation, that wasn't uncommon. But I will share this that I think would never fly today. Guess how many times he moved for the company in 40 years? 20 times.
Oh my gosh.
And that's what you did because you were a company man, right, back in the day. And if the company said that's what you needed to do, that's what you did. Yeah. And, part of it was because of his job in the beginning. And it just necessitated like every 6 months to move. But even when the kids were older, Julie had a comment about, do companies actually care about the younger generations? The younger generations can sense inauthenticity in their employer, and they'll bolt if they feel that, or if they truly feel they're just, they're not valued. Speak to that, Brian.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the different generations, authenticity and meaning became more and more important. So for Generation X, we could tell that our bosses were inauthentic, but all we did was grumble to ourselves and say, this is terrible, I hate the guy. But we kept coming to work. When it got to the millennials, and Generation Z is the same way, they're like, this is ridiculous. Why am I still doing this? I'm going to go find something else to do. And for Gen Z, by the way, I got these two things cooking anyway. So maybe I'll go be a full-time, whatever the side gig was. So it's about generations have recognized, people not treating them right. It's just the willingness to do something about it that the younger generations are a little braver with than the older ones were.
Right. Peter A has an interesting comment. He says, sometimes I feel like Robert De Niro in the movie The Intern. What's the best way to take the heat since the boomers don't have the numbers anymore?
So it's, one of the things that is a real attribute of baby boomers, and if you're not feeling it exactly yourself, you can embrace it, is a love of lifetime learning. So boomers are not leaving work because it's still kind of okay and they sort of like doing it. And so a way to connect with younger generations is to, one, take something that boomers are already good at, which is mentoring. Boomers love to talk about their career. They love to talk about the steps they've taken so they can mentor. But in terms of that lifetime learning, reverse mentoring. So go to a person of a younger generation and go, hey, can I learn from you? There's this, stereotypically piece of technology that I can't figure out Zoom. I can't figure out how to do my background with the ocean behind me. Can you teach me how to do that? And a lot of times the younger generation will be like, sweet, like somebody cares about my opinion. My work is now slightly more meaningful. And, to answer your question, there's now, it's not the baby boomers, the bad guy, it's the baby boomers asking for help, and it tends to connect the generation in a really positive way.
Right. Great. Alan has a great comment. He says, he works in retail, so he's managing across all of these generations, and he's learned how to treat them all with respect, but manage them differently. So for older people who say have a military background, he can be more direct. If it's younger, he now over-explains and accommodates things. But he says he learns from each generation. And I think that's a great point. I think one of the things that we have to learn is, and I would say this is an older generation, just because maybe we don't need the explanation doesn't mean we can't take a little extra time to be able to explain the overarching reasoning behind a direction or why it's important a decision is made. So I think that's something that the older generations can make that accommodation. What's something that you think the younger generation should do when dealing with the older ones, Brian?
I think it is the learning of how that older generation approaches things. What I've seen in different organizations is this generational language emerges. And I've even had people come to me and say, hey, I know you want to do it the Generation X way, where you work independently and don't work as a team, but I feel like I can get more out of this if I bring a team together. That's my millennial coming out. Are you cool with me calling a team together and having us get different perspectives? And it's like, yeah, when you put it that way, totally. If you just came to me and said, this is stupid, then I'm probably just going to say, well, no, do it my way. But if you bring that explanation and use the vernacular of the generations, I've seen it work really well. And not just with somebody who talks about it all the time, but with other people in business.
I think hopefully this will be something that will come out of this global pandemic, is that this idea of flexibility, and that work is no longer, for a lot of people, where you go. that work is what you do, and the ability for people to manage and have flexibility. I think because we've been forced for now months on end to work more remotely and have that greater flexibility. To me, that will be something I hope that the older generations will now get more familiar working remotely, and it'll become more accepted, because for these younger generations, it's no longer a perk. You know, being able to work remotely and have greater flexibility is an expectation. I'm gonna check. I think that's it. And I know, Brian, you were gonna kind of wrap things up here with, 5 final stories to kind of put a bow on this. So do you want to jump into that and
Yeah.
share each of these, how people can see things from different perspectives?
Let's do it. So this is the same scenario as viewed by the 5 different generations. So for the matures, this market is terrible. The customers are thinking about bringing some of our services in-house. The competition is heating up, and I love it. Same scenario for the baby boomers. Some people think this market is terrible, but it's great. With all the moving pieces, it's really challenging. Reminds me of when I was a sales leader at a small firm 30 years ago. The technology industry was starting to take off. They needed help. I'm going to tell you about my job my history for another 5 minutes. Okay, that's baby boomers. Generation X, this market is terrible. Because the market is so dynamic, my manager keeps telling me what to do. If he just let me do my job, I'd be done in time to see my kid playing his little league game. Work-life balance, separation. For the millennials, this market is terrible. The customers are thinking about bringing some of our services in-house, and the competition is heating up. With all the challenges, my contributions are getting overlooked. I have a lot to offer. If I don't get promoted soon, I'm going to start looking for another job. And then lastly, Generation Z, this is kind of cool. I have 3 gigs going right now. They don't pay a lot, but I have plenty of time to do the things I want. I might be the president of a company next, or start my own business. I haven't decided yet. So here's the bottom line. We all have the mental image of the perfect employee. But when we only look at people through the lenses of our own generation, that's when we miss out on great ideas and great energy and the ability to make our teams more successful. But when we take off those goggles and look at everybody in terms of the different attributes that they bring to our teams, to our work, to our lives, that's when we have the opportunity to be really successful. And when I mean successful, I mean getting along better with the subordinates who work for us, our peers, and maybe even our bosses.
Great. Thank you, Brian. That's awesome. Hey, as we wrap up, again, this was episode 7 of a 9-part series. So same time, same bat channel next week. We're going to be looking at the red goldfish, which is 5 ways to motivate sales and loyalty through purpose. Special treat, I'm going to have Keith Green, who I wrote the nonprofit edition with, and Graham Newell. So we'll have not the not-for-profit and the for-profit, or what we call the for-purpose mantra. So we look forward to joining you next week. Here's Brian and I's contact information. Any final thoughts, Brian?
Everybody in the entire world is somehow connected to Stan Phelps, so you're probably already linked to him, but not everybody is connected to me. So love to connect with you on LinkedIn. And for both of us, if you have questions where you're like, hey, the more I think about this, geez, I got this particular situation. Can we talk through it? Can we email through it? Absolutely, send us a question. Happy to chat with you to at least write through, if not talk through, the situation you may be facing, and maybe we can help.
Great. And Sal, who's been helping us in the background. Sal, I was just thinking, let's definitely follow up with everyone to send them the the gray generational matrix, because I think that's just a brilliant tool. Not that you're, it was a great presentation, Brian, but people aren't going to remember every difference in how
Yes.
to manage,
Yes.
recruit, and inspire,
That's
and train, right? So we'll get that to you, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Tuesday.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Appreciate it.